I am Tasha. I am 34 years old, and I spent 12 years running my family catering empire while they took all the credit. Last Juneteenth, my parents publicly handed the CEO title to my spoiled sister and her arrogant husband, telling me I was better off working as their assistant. I just smiled, dropped my master keys right into my mother's famous potato salad, and walked out. Before I tell you how their entire business collapsed in less than a week, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your family who really holds the power. Heritage Elite Catering and Events was supposed to be our family legacy. For over a decade, I gave that company my blood, sweat, and sanity. I was the one who woke up at 3 in the morning to negotiate with meat vendors and secure the freshest produce in the city. I was the one who navigated the endless maze of city permits, health inspections, and zoning laws. I built our client list from small local church gatherings to high-profile corporate galas. The stress gave me gray hairs before I turned 30. Meanwhile, my younger sister Jasmine treated the company like her personal ATM. She was 32 years old, beautiful, charismatic, and completely allergic to hard work. She spent her days getting expensive manicures and posting staged photos of our catering setups on her social media, pretending she was the mastermind behind the magic. My parents, Marcus and Brenda, worshipped the ground she walked on. To them, Jasmine was the perfect image of Black generational wealth. She had the right aesthetic, the right smile, and recently she had acquired the right husband. Trent was a 35-year-old corporate finance guy who loved throwing around empty buzzwords like optimize and synergize. He was white privileged and looked at our family business like a cute little project he could easily dominate. My parents were completely blinded by his tailored suits and his fancy business degree. They thought he was the ultimate prize for their golden child, the key to taking our local business national. I tolerated him because I thought my parents saw my true value. I truly believed that my 12 years of absolute sacrifice would finally be rewarded when my father retired. The brutal betrayal happened at our annual Juneteenth company cookout. It was also the 30th anniversary of Heritage Elite. The backyard of my parents' sprawling suburban home was packed with relatives, local politicians, and our most important clients. I had been up since dawn managing the catering staff, ensuring the brisket was smoked to perfection and making sure my parents looked like flawless hosts in front of their wealthy friends. My feet ached and my back was stiff, but I was incredibly excited. My father had told me he was making a major announcement, and I knew he was finally stepping down. I stood near the patio wiping sweat from my forehead, ready to officially take the reins as chief executive officer. My father clinked his crystal glass with a silver fork. The lively chatter in the yard died down as everyone turned to look at the patriarch. He gave a sweeping, emotional speech about building this business from nothing, about the unique struggles of Black entrepreneurship, and about passing the heavy torch to the next generation. My heart swelled with pride. I took a step forward, reaching out slightly as my father pulled a thick stack of legal transfer papers from his leather folio. I had earned this right. I had sacrificed my youth, my social life, and my peace of mind for this very moment. But the papers never made it to my hands. Trent stepped up with a sickeningly smug grin and smoothly slid the folder right out of my father's grip, passing it directly to Jasmine. I froze. The air in my lungs just vanished. I looked at my father, expecting him to correct the blatant mistake, but he just smiled proudly at Jasmine. My mother stepped forward, holding a microphone. Her voice echoed across the manicured lawn, carrying a tone of absolute triumph. "We are so proud to announce that Jasmine is the new CEO of Heritage Elite." My mother beamed, putting an arm around my sister. "The company needs a bright, engaging face to move forward. Jasmine has the perfect aesthetic and the social presence to elevate our brand in the modern market. And with Trent bringing his vast corporate background to optimize our revenue, we are going to reach spectacular new heights." I stood there in front of over 100 people, completely humiliated. My mother turned to me with a condescending smile full of fake pity. "Tasha, sweetheart, you are going to stay on as the operations assistant. You are going to help Trent and Jasmine transition into their leadership roles. You are just better behind the scenes, baby." You do not have the personality for the front office, but we need your help keeping things organized in the back." The crowd offered a polite smattering of applause. Trent looked at me, lifting his expensive champagne glass in a mocking toast. He actually winked at me. They fully expected me to lower my head and accept my place in the shadows. They expected me to be the good, quiet workhorse while they reaped the glamorous rewards of my labor. I did not cry. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me, replacing years of blind loyalty with pure focus. I stepped right up to the microphone, pulling it firmly from my mother's hand. The audio feedback whined sharply, causing a few prominent guests to wince and cover their ears. Behind the scenes, I asked, my voice echoing loudly across the sudden dead silence of the yard. "Is that what you call it, Mom? Let us talk about what really happens behind the scenes. Like the time I drained my entire college savings account to pay off the IRS because Dad triggered a massive tax audit in 2014. I spent my tuition money to save this beautiful house from foreclosure, while Jasmine was spending company funds on a luxury gap year in Europe." Loud gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. My mother's face turned a horrifying shade of gray as her perfect church reputation shattered in real time. Jasmine dropped her champagne glass onto the patio stones, where it shattered into 100 pieces. My father's face contorted with intense rage. He marched toward me, his voice a low, dangerous growl meant to intimidate. "Tasha, you shut your mouth right now. You are embarrassing this family in front of our most important guests. If you say one more word disrespecting this family legacy, I will fire you on the spot." I looked at the man I had practically destroyed my own life to please. He was willing to publicly discard me, to protect his own fragile ego, and elevate a son-in-law who had not put a single drop of sweat into our business. I reached deep into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the heavy brass ring of master keys. These keys unlocked the commercial kitchens, the delivery trucks, the executive offices, and the secure storage vaults. They represented 12 years of my absolute dedication to a family that saw me as nothing more than a convenient tool. "You cannot fire me, Dad," I said, my voice dead calm. "I quit." I tossed the heavy ring of master keys right into the center of my mother's pristine display of potato salad. The heavy brass sank deep into the bowl, splashing mayonnaise onto the crisp white tablecloth and ruining the perfect presentation. I turned my back on all of them and started walking toward the side gate. I did not look back, but I made sure to leave them with one final terrifying reality check. "Good luck with the mayor's 1,000-plate charity gala on Friday. Let us see how well Trent can synergize a menu for 1,000 people by himself." The caller ID flashing on my phone screen displayed the official seal of the mayor's office. I took a slow sip of my black coffee before answering with my standard professional greeting. On the other end was Valerie, the mayor's chief of staff, and she sounded like a woman on the verge of a massive cardiac event. She did not bother with the usual polite pleasantries. She demanded to know why she had just received an email from a man named Trent Blackwell detailing a completely restructured and frankly insulting menu for Friday's 1,000-plate charity gala. According to Valerie, Trent and Jasmine had decided to optimize the event budget by replacing the promised prime rib carving stations with a buffet of lukewarm pulled pork sliders. Even worse, they had decided to swap the rented crystal table settings for premium disposable plasticware. Valerie was absolutely furious. She told me the mayor was hosting 3 state senators and a billionaire philanthropist at this particular gala. Serving those high-profile guests out of plastic containers was political and social suicide. I let Valerie vent her absolute outrage for 2 full minutes before I spoke. I calmly informed her that I was no longer the chief executive officer of Heritage Elite, and that any logistical changes were strictly the visionary choices of the new management team. The silence on the phone was incredibly heavy. Valerie asked who exactly was running the show now. When I told her it was my younger sister Jasmine and her corporate finance husband Valerie, actually laughed a sharp, bitter sound. She explicitly stated she would rather cancel the entire gala and refund the tickets than let Jasmine turn a high-society political fundraiser into a cheap backyard barbecue. Then she asked the million-dollar question. She asked where I was going next. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. I told Valerie that my new solo event management firm was fully operational as of this morning. I explained that I retained the direct personal contact information for every premium vendor in the tri-state area, and that my dedicated team of elite servers was loyal to me alone. I promised her the prime rib carving stations, the crystal glassware, and the flawless execution she had originally paid for. Valerie did not even hesitate for a single second. She told me she was sending a formal cancellation notice to Heritage Elite immediately and drafting a new contract under my personal LLC. She wired the massive event deposit directly to my new business account before we even ended the call. The entire defection took less than 15 minutes. The biggest political event of the year belonged entirely to me. I spent the next 2 hours making strategic phone calls. Every single vendor, Marcus and Trent desperately relied on, answered my call on the first ring. When I explained I was launching my own firm and needed to secure massive supplies for the mayor's gala, they jumped on board without a second thought. The luxury florist, the wholesale meat supplier, the specialty linen company, they all knew I was the one who paid the invoices on time for the past 12 years. They did not care about the Heritage Elite brand at all. They cared about Tasha. By noon, my new company was fully staffed and perfectly supplied. I was just reviewing the final floor plan on my laptop when a massive, terrifying crash echoed through my small apartment. The loud sound of splintering wood made me jump straight up from my chair. My front door was violently kicked open and slammed hard against the drywall. Jasmine stormed into my living room looking absolutely unhinged. Her perfect silk blouse was wrinkled, and her expensive designer purse swung wildly from her arm as she marched aggressively toward me. Her face was contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. She started screaming at the top of her lungs before she even crossed the threshold. She accused me of calling the mayor's office behind her back to poison them against her. She yelled that I was a bitter, jealous, ugly spinster who simply could not stand to see her own beautiful sister succeed in life. I closed my laptop securely and stood up, keeping my hands perfectly still by my sides. I watched her throw a childish tantrum, waving her arms around and violently knocking a stack of industry magazines off my coffee table. Jasmine screamed that Trent was totally humiliated. She claimed the cancellation email from Valerie had arrived right when Trent was bragging to his former corporate finance buddies about his new powerful CEO status. She blamed me for making her husband look like a complete fool. She said I was actively trying to destroy her marriage because no man had ever wanted to marry me. She invoked our parents, saying I was a massive disgrace to our Black family legacy, and that the entire church congregation would know exactly how evil and vindictive I truly was. I let her scream until her voice went completely hoarse. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply walked over to the magazines she had knocked down and picked them up one by one. I told her that Trent made himself look like a fool the exact moment he thought premium disposable plastic belonged at a formal political gala. I explained that I did not have to sabotage her at all because her own profound incompetence did the job perfectly. Jasmine lunged forward, suddenly jabbing her sharp manicured finger hard into my shoulder. She told me I was going to rot in a jail cell. She threatened to call the police right that second and have me arrested for corporate sabotage and theft of intellectual property. She claimed Trent already had his expensive lawyers drafting major criminal charges against me for stealing company clients. I brushed her finger off my shoulder like it was a minor annoying insect. I looked her dead in the eyes and slowly pointed my finger toward the small blinking red light tucked high in the corner of my hallway ceiling. I told her that she had just committed a serious felony. I explained that the security camera had captured her violently kicking down my locked door and trespassing into my private residence. I told her in a voice completely devoid of any emotion that I had already sent the live feed footage of her breaking my door lock directly to my lawyer. I advised her to turn around and walk out immediately before I dialed 911 and had the new CEO of Heritage Elite dragged out of my apartment complex in handcuffs. Get out. The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving my apartment in absolute silence. I barely had time to exhale before my phone vibrated across the kitchen island. Then it vibrated again and again in rapid succession. I knew my mother had activated her favorite weapon, the church telephone tree. My voicemail filled faster than I could delete the messages. I pressed play on the first one, and the disapproving voice of Auntie Shirley echoed through my kitchen, telling me I was committing a grave sin by turning my back on the family that raised me. She lectured me about the struggles of building a Black-owned business and letting the devil use my jealousy to tear down my father's legacy. The next voicemail was from Deacon Hayes quoting scripture about honoring my parents. The following 10 messages were variations of the exact same script. Brenda was working overtime painting me as the bitter single sister trying to destroy Jasmine's marriage out of pure spite. They called me selfish. They called me lost. They demanded I march back to my parents' house, drop to my knees, and beg for forgiveness. I casually tossed my phone onto the counter, letting the voicemails pile up. I spent the next 48 hours finalizing vendor contracts for the mayor's gala, securing premium beef and crystal glassware. But the constant ringing of my phone was a nagging reminder that Brenda was controlling the narrative in my community. If I let her toxic lies spread unchecked, she would try to use her church connections to sabotage my new business before it even launched. I needed to cut the head off the snake in front of her entire audience. Wednesday night Bible study at Mount Zion Baptist Church was the undisputed social hub of my parents' entire world. When I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary, the thick hum of conversation instantly died. Every head turned in my direction. The silence was heavy and suffocating. I ignored their glaring eyes and walked straight down the side aisle, taking a seat near the back. My mother sat in the second row, wearing her finest modest dress, perfectly styled hair, and a deeply tragic expression. My father sat stiffly beside her with Trent and Jasmine completing the picture of the suffering righteous family. Jasmine was dabbing her eyes, playing the traumatized victim flawlessly, while Trent rested a protective arm around his wife, pretending to be the strong corporate savior holding their family together. The pastor stepped up to the pulpit, announcing that Sister Brenda had a special prayer request to share with the congregation. My mother stood up, gripping the wooden pew in front of her like she needed it to keep from collapsing. She bowed her head, letting out a perfectly timed, shaky breath. She asked the congregation to pray for her eldest daughter. She prayed that God would soften my hardened heart and remove the dark, heavy spirit of jealousy that had supposedly consumed my soul. She cried genuine tears as she asked the Lord to forgive me for trying to steal the clients my father had worked so hard to secure. She prayed that I would find peace instead of trying to destroy my younger sister's beautiful new marriage and the family business. She begged God to guide my lost soul back to the righteous path so I could accept my supportive role and stop attacking my own flesh and blood. Soft murmurs of agreement rippled through the sanctuary. People were nodding along, shooting pitying glances at my father and angry scowls in my direction. I did not wait for her to finish her theatrical performance. I stood up, pushing my wooden chair back. The loud scrape of the chair legs against the floor cut straight through her prayer. I did not yell, and I did not cry. I let my voice carry through the quiet sanctuary with absolute steady authority. I suggest you pray for Trent instead. Mom, I spoke clearly, ensuring every single person in the room heard me. You might want to ask the Lord to forgive him for buying Jasmine's $30,000 diamond engagement ring using the company's emergency payroll account. The entire sanctuary erupted in a massive, synchronized gasp. The sound of 50 people sucking in their breath at the exact same time was deafening. Auntie Shirley dropped her fan. The pastor gripped the sides of his pulpit, completely stunned. I kept my eyes locked directly on my mother. I told her that her brilliant new chief executive officer and his corporate finance genius husband had drained the employee tax reserve to fund their lavish lifestyle before they even had the keys to the building. I suggested she pray for a good bankruptcy lawyer because the IRS does not accept apologies from the pulpit. My mother's eyes rolled back in her head. She let out a dramatic wail and collapsed straight backward, fainting into the arms of the women sitting behind her. The sanctuary dissolved into absolute chaos. People were shouting and fanning my mother. Jasmine shrieked hysterically, checking her expensive ring like it had suddenly caught fire. Trent completely dropped his polished corporate facade. His face turned violently red and the veins in his neck bulged. He let out a furious, aggressive roar and vaulted over the wooden pew, charging straight down the center aisle toward me. His fists were balled up and his eyes were wild with violent rage. He looked fully prepared to strike me right there in the house of worship. He did not make it past the fifth row. 3 large deacons intercepted him, tackling him hard against the wooden benches and pinning his arms behind his back while he thrashed and screamed obscenities. I stood perfectly still, watching the corporate savior expose his true violent nature to the entire congregation. I turned my back on the screaming crowd, pushed the heavy wooden doors open, and walked out into the cool evening air. The cool evening air outside the church was a welcome relief, but I knew the war was far from over. Trent was a man whose entire identity was built on unearned superiority, and public humiliation was his ultimate trigger. Since his violent outburst at Mount Zion had ended with him pinned to a wooden pew by the church deacons, he did the only thing cowards in tailored suits know how to do. He hid behind a lawyer. Less than 24 hours later, a courier knocked aggressively on my apartment door and handed me a thick, terrifyingly heavy legal envelope. It was a formal cease and desist order from Sterling and Vance, one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigation firms in the entire city. The document was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. Trent was threatening to sue me for $5 million, citing tortious interference, breach of fiduciary duty, and malicious corporate espionage. He demanded I immediately dissolve my new LLC, release all poached clients back to Heritage Elite, and surrender any profits I had collected. The final paragraph stated that if I did not comply within 48 hours, they would seek an emergency injunction to freeze all my personal and business bank accounts. They wanted to starve me out and force me to surrender. I set the intimidating stack of papers down on my kitchen counter and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. They expected pure panic. They expected me to call them crying and begging for mercy, terrified of the massive legal machine they had unleashed. Instead, I called the phone number listed on the firm's premium letterhead and calmly scheduled an in-person meeting for that exact same afternoon. I dressed with absolute precision. I chose a structured dark navy power suit that projected total unshakable authority and drove downtown to the financial district. The offices of Sterling and Vance occupied the 50th floor of a towering glass high-rise designed specifically to make you feel small and insignificant the moment you stepped out of the elevator. The receptionist escorted me into a massive mahogany boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city below. Trent was already sitting at the massive conference table, pressing a small blue ice pack to his bruised cheekbone, courtesy of his physical altercation at the church. Beside him sat a silver-haired man in a pristine, custom-tailored suit, projecting an aura of absolute legal menace. This was Arthur Sterling, a senior partner, and the expensive attack dog Trent had hired to ruin my life. Trent smirked the moment I walked through the heavy oak doors, practically vibrating with arrogant delight. He genuinely thought he had me backed into an inescapable corner. Mr. Sterling did not even offer to shake my hand. He steepled his fingers and stared at me coldly across the polished wood. He immediately pointed out that I had arrived without legal representation, calling it a highly ill-advised and profoundly foolish decision, given the sheer magnitude of the financial damages I was facing. He launched into an aggressive, calculated monologue designed to completely break my spirit. He used heavy legal jargon threatening to decimate my new business venture and tie me up in crippling litigation for the next decade. He painted a terrifying picture of my future, describing exactly how he would seize my assets, ruin my professional reputation, and leave me utterly bankrupt. Trent leaned back in his expensive leather chair, soaking in every single word of the threat with visible satisfaction. "You really thought you could just walk away with my clients?" Trent sneered, dropping the ice pack onto the table. You thought you could embarrass me in front of that entire congregation and face zero consequences. I am going to bury you, Tasha. You are going to be working a drive-through window by the time my lawyers are done draining your bank accounts. You should have just stayed in the background where you belong. I sat perfectly still, allowing his desperate, insecure threats to echo through the large, silent room. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact, and I certainly did not show a single ounce of fear. I calmly reached into my sleek leather tote bag and pulled out a single thin manila folder. I placed it flat on the mahogany table and slid it smoothly across the polished surface directly toward Arthur Sterling. I ignored Trent completely and addressed the senior partner with a voice as cold as ice. I do not need a lawyer to read a simple contract, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice steady and unwavering. I highly suggest you open that folder and review the contents before you continue threatening to freeze my accounts or destroy my livelihood. The silver-haired lawyer frowned slightly, clearly annoyed by my absolute lack of intimidation. He flipped the folder open with a sharp flick of his wrist. Inside were only 3 pieces of paper, but they held the explosive power to completely dismantle Trent's entire delusional empire. I watched the lawyer's expert eyes scan the highlighted paragraphs as I calmly explained the brutal unspoken reality of the family business. You see, Trent thinks he married into a massive established corporate entity, I explained, leaning forward slightly to command the room. But my father, Marcus, is a man who loves the glamorous image of wealth much more than the strict discipline required to maintain it. 12 years ago, Marcus made a series of catastrophic real estate investments that completely destroyed his personal credit rating. Heritage Elite could not secure a single commercial lease, a vendor line of credit, or a basic wholesale discount under its own corporate name. The company was financially radioactive and constantly on the verge of total collapse. Arthur Sterling stopped reading and looked up at me, a sudden sharp realization dawning in his experienced eyes. He slowly turned the page to look at the next document, tracing the lines with his expensive gold pen. So I stepped in. I continued, my voice ringing with cold, hard, undeniable truth. I spent 12 years building flawless personal credit while working myself to the bone. Every single premium vendor contract, every non-compete agreement, every wholesale supply line, and every exclusive venue partnership was negotiated and signed under my personal name and my personal social security number. Heritage Elite does not actually own those crucial client relationships or those vital supply chains. I do. I leased the commercial kitchen equipment under my name and simply allowed the family business to use it to keep us afloat. Legally speaking, I did not poach a single client or vendor from Heritage Elite. Heritage Elite has been illegally poaching my personal clients and operating under my private licenses since the exact moment I quit. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Trent looked back and forth between me and his expensive lawyer, a look of panicked confusion twisting his arrogant features. He demanded to know what I was talking about, ordering Sterling to tell me I was lying and to draft the lawsuit immediately. He shouted that he owned 50% of the company and that the lucrative contracts belonged to him by right of marriage and his new title. Arthur Sterling did not say a single word to me. He slowly closed the thin manila folder and rested his manicured hands flat on top of it. The predatory arrogance had completely vanished from his face, replaced by the grim professional reality of a lawyer who realizes his deeply arrogant client has just led him into a massive, unwinnable legal trap. He turned his head slowly to look at Trent. The air in the room grew unbearably tight as the multi-million-dollar lawyer delivered the final fatal blow to Trent's massive ego. "She is right," Sterling said, his voice flat and completely devoid of any sympathy. "Every operational contract keeping your business alive is legally bound to her personal guarantee. You have absolutely no legal standing here. You have no case against her." He pushed his heavy chair back from the conference table and delivered the ultimate crushing reality check. In fact, Trent, considering you have been operating under her personal health licenses and utilizing her private vendor accounts without authorization since she formally resigned, she can sue you for everything you have left. I walked out of Arthur Sterling's office building, and the summer air had never tasted so sweet. The corporate giant had been brought to his knees by a simple paper trail. I spent Wednesday evening transferring all my essential vendor accounts to my new solo firm, leaving Heritage Elite, with absolutely nothing but a hollow brand name and my father's terrible credit score. By Thursday morning, the reality of their situation finally hit them like a freight train. It was barely 7 in the morning when the supply chain completely collapsed. Jasmine had a massive high society wedding scheduled for Saturday. The bride was the daughter of a prominent state judge, and the menu demanded premium Wagyu beef, imported caviar, and organic white truffles. The total food cost alone was over $40,000. Under my management, our suppliers would drop off the inventory on a net 30-day payment schedule because my word was my bond. I had spent over a decade cultivating deep personal trust with these farmers and wholesalers. But without my personal guarantee attached to the Heritage Elite account, the rules drastically changed overnight. The vendors demanded payment upfront in full before a single delivery truck would even leave the warehouse. Trent, of course, did not have $40,000 in liquid cash because he had already drained the emergency operating accounts for Jasmine's ring, and God knows what else to fund their lavish new lifestyle. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing crystal glassware arrangements for the mayor's gala when my cell phone started vibrating aggressively across the marble countertop. The caller ID flashed Jasmine's name. I let it ring 3 times before I finally pressed accept. I expected another round of screaming threats, or perhaps my mother jumping on the line to demand immediate submission to the family. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of hyperventilating. Jasmine was sobbing so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. The arrogant golden child from the cookout, the furious woman who tried to kick my door down just 2 days ago, was completely gone. In her place was a terrified little girl realizing she was in way over her head. "Tasha, please, you have to help me," Jasmine begged, her voice cracking with pure panic. The meat supplier just turned his trucks around. He refused to unload the Wagyu. He said the account is frozen and we need to pay cash on the barrel. Trent is locked inside his office, pacing and sweating. He will not even answer his phone. He does not know what to do. The judge is going to sue us into absolute bankruptcy if we ruin his daughter's wedding. Please, Tasha, just call the vendor. Tell him you will vouch for us one last time. I will pay you. I will do whatever you want. I listened to her desperate pleas while tracing the rim of my coffee mug. It was almost poetic how quickly the illusion of their competence had shattered. They wanted the shiny title and the unearned prestige, but they had absolutely no idea how to carry the crushing weight of the actual responsibility. I took a slow breath and let the silence stretch over the phone line, making her sweat. "Jasmine," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and devoid of any sisterly warmth. "Do you remember your Sweet 16 party?" She stopped crying for a second, clearly confused by the question. "What does that have to do with anything?" she sniffled. "We are going to lose everything, Tasha." I remember it perfectly. I continued, ignoring her mounting panic. "Mom and Dad gave you an unlimited budget to plan the ultimate winter wonderland bash for your friends. You were supposed to submit the final catering numbers to our kitchen staff a full week in advance. But you were too busy shopping for your custom dress and taking photos at the mall. You completely forgot to place the order. We woke up the morning of your party with 200 wealthy teenagers arriving in 8 hours and absolutely no food prepped in the kitchen." I remember the sheer panic in the house that morning. Mom was crying in the living room. Dad was screaming at the staff. And you were hiding under the covers in your bedroom, refusing to come out and face the disaster you created. I was 18 years old and I had a 103-degree fever from a severe strain of the flu. But I did not hide. I tied an apron over my clothes, popped 4 ibuprofen, and walked straight into the freezing walk-in cooler. I worked for 18 hours straight. I stood over a hot stove, shivering violently and sweating through my shirt, frantically assembling miniature beef Wellingtons and hand-piping 300 individual dessert tarts. I burned both of my arms on the commercial ovens. I nearly passed out twice from the fever. But when your friends arrived, the buffet was absolutely flawless. You took all the credit, of course. You told everyone you designed the elegant menu yourself, while I collapsed in the back pantry and slept on a sack of flour. Tasha. Please, Jasmine whined, completely missing the entire point of the memory. I am sorry about that. I really am. But I need you right now. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth was heavy enough to crush her all on its own. I saved you then, Jasmine, I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. I sacrificed my own health and my own sanity to cover up your incredible incompetence because you were my little sister. But you are not a child anymore. You are the Chief Executive Officer of Heritage Elite. You have your brilliant corporate finance husband to optimize your revenue. I am just the bitter spinster you tried to discard, remember? So act like a CEO, Jasmine. Fix it yourself. I tapped the red button on my screen, instantly cutting off her frantic wailing. I set the phone face down on the counter and took a deep breath, letting the final shred of guilt completely evaporate from my chest. I had carried them on my back for 12 long years. It was time for them to learn how to walk on their own. I turned my attention back to my laptop, ready to finalize the floral arrangements for the mayor. But before my fingers could even touch the keyboard, my phone lit up again. It was not Jasmine calling back to beg for more help. It was a high-priority email notification. I picked up the device and opened my inbox. The email was an automated alert from the state health department. Because I was still listed as the primary contact on my personal ServSafe certifications, the system automatically generated a copy of all official actions to my address. I read the subject line twice, just to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. The email detailed an immediate emergency action. Heritage Elite's multi-million-dollar commercial kitchen had just been raided by state health inspectors. I scrolled through the attached PDF report, my eyes scanning the brutal bureaucratic efficiency of the state's actions. The inspectors had arrived at exactly 8 in the morning, right in the middle of prep for the judge's daughter's wedding. According to the official logs, they found unauthorized personnel operating commercial cooking equipment without a certified food safety manager on site. They immediately issued a code red violation, padlocked the walk-in refrigerators, and slapped a neon red closure tag on the front doors. Over $40,000 of highly perishable luxury inventory was now locked inside, warming up and rotting by the minute. Heritage Elite was completely paralyzed. My phone did not stay silent for long. Less than 5 minutes after the state email arrived, my screen lit up with a video call from Marcus. My father never used video calls unless he wanted to use his physical presence to intimidate me. I accepted the call and propped the phone against my coffee maker, pouring myself a fresh cup while his face filled the screen. He was standing in the middle of the main Heritage Elite office, his face purple with rage. Behind him, through the glass partitions, I could see the kitchen staff sitting on folding chairs looking completely lost, while Jasmine paced back and forth, pulling at her hair. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" Marcus roared, his voice echoing through his empty kitchen. "You called the health department on us. You sent state inspectors to raid my company like we are common criminals. You are trying to destroy the legacy I built with my bare hands just because you are jealous of your sister." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast warm my throat. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life taking credit for my back-breaking labor and felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no guilt, no lingering desire for his approval. "I did not call anyone Dad," I replied, my voice perfectly level, cutting through his hysterical shouting. "I did not have to. The state's automated compliance system flagged you the moment my formal resignation was processed through the municipal database." He stopped yelling, his heavy chest heaving as he stared at the camera. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, gripping the phone tighter. "I am talking about the law, Dad," I said, leaning forward so he could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. "The Master Commercial Catering License, the ServSafe Executive Certification, the Municipal Health Department permits, and the $1 million liability insurance policy were all registered directly to my personal biometric credentials. The state requires a qualified managing director to hold those licenses. When I quit, those licenses instantly became void. You have been operating an illegal rogue kitchen for 3 days. You brought this entirely on yourself by handing my kitchen over to 2 people who do not even know how to properly calibrate a commercial freezer. Marcus blinked, the color slowly draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of the disaster finally penetrated his stubborn ego. He slowly turned his phone so I could see the rest of the room. Trent was standing near the door, still wearing his expensive tailored suit, but he was sweating profusely. He looked like a cornered animal. "This is a minor bureaucratic hiccup," Marcus barked, trying to regain control of his collapsing empire. He turned his furious gaze onto his brilliant new chief executive officer. "Trent, get down to the municipal licensing board right this second. Take the corporate credit card, pay the emergency expedition fees, and put all the licenses under your name. Tell them we are restructuring. Do whatever it takes to get that red tag off my kitchen doors before the judge sues us into oblivion." Trent did not move. He stood completely frozen, his eyes darting frantically toward the floor. He swallowed hard, adjusting his silk tie with a trembling hand. Marcus took a threatening step toward him, holding the phone so I had a front row seat to the glorious unraveling of the golden boy. "Did you not hear me?" Marcus shouted, his voice booming through the office. "I said, go get the license, Trent. You are the CEO. You have an MBA. Fix this right now." "I cannot," Trent whispered, his voice cracking. He looked terrified, completely stripped of his usual arrogant corporate swagger. "What do you mean you cannot?" Marcus demanded, practically spitting the words. "It is a basic commercial background check. You fill out a form and they stamp it. Go do your job." Trent took a step backward, physically retreating from my father's wrath. He looked at Jasmine, who had stopped pacing and was now staring at her husband in pure horror. The silence in the office was thick and heavy, vibrating with the weight of a massive unspoken secret. "I cannot pass the municipal background check," Trent stammered, finally forcing the words out. "The state requires a rigorous financial and criminal screening for anyone holding a master commercial catering license. They check everything." And Marcus pushed, stepping closer. "Why would that stop you?" "Because of the fraud charge," Trent blurted out, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "Because I have a felony wire fraud charge from my last investment firm. I pleaded it down and they sealed it under a non-disclosure agreement, but it is still visible on a state-level biometric background check. If I apply for that license, they will flag the application immediately and deny it. I am legally prohibited from holding a bonded commercial license in this state." I pressed the red button on my screen and ended the video call, leaving Marcus to deal with the explosive reality of his hand-picked corporate savior. I closed my laptop and went to sleep perfectly soundly for the first time in weeks. I knew the silence would not last. Jasmine was a creature of modern vanity, and when a narcissist is backed into a corner, they always run to an audience. By Friday morning, my phone was buzzing relentlessly with alerts from friends, former colleagues, and confused vendors. Jasmine had decided that if she could not win in the boardroom or the kitchen, she would win in the court of public opinion. She had taken to TikTok. I opened the app and found her face filling my screen. It was a masterclass in digital manipulation. She had stripped off her usual heavy contouring, swapped her designer blouses for a plain, oversized sweatshirt, and pulled her hair into a messy, uneven bun. She sat on the floor of her immaculate living room, clutching a coffee mug with both hands, staring into the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes. She started the video with a shaky breath. She claimed she never thought she would have to make a post like this, but she had to protect her family's legacy. She never said my name, but the implication was unmistakable. She spun a fabricated, highly detailed story about a disgruntled former employee who had become dangerously jealous of the new progressive management team. She accused this unnamed employee of systematically sabotaging the kitchen, cutting off food supplies to ruin high-profile events, and deliberately locking minority owners out of their own vendor accounts. She even threw in carefully placed buzzwords, hinting at racist and discriminatory practices, claiming this toxic individual was trying to destroy a Black-owned business out of pure spite. She begged her followers to stand with Heritage Elite and support them through this coordinated attack. The video already had 250,000 views. The comment section was a massive angry mob demanding the identity of the disgruntled employee. They were calling for boycotts, threatening to find my new business and destroy my reputation before I even opened my doors. Jasmine was attempting to weaponize cancel culture to bury her own catastrophic failures. She wanted to drown me in digital outrage so nobody would look at the actual facts. I did not record a reaction video. I did not cry on camera or type out an angry defensive rant on my story. Digital drama is fleeting and fueled by emotion, but financial crimes are permanent and fueled by paper trails. I opened my laptop and bypassed all the social media applications entirely. I logged directly into my professional LinkedIn network. This was the platform where the city's top event planners, corporate clients, and high society families actually conducted their business. I drafted a post that was brutally clinical, perfectly polite, and completely devoid of any emotion. I wrote a brief statement clarifying that I had officially severed all operational and financial ties with Heritage Elite. I stated that due to a sudden coordinated misinformation campaign regarding my exit, I felt it was my fiduciary duty to provide absolute transparency to my professional network and former clients. Below that brief paragraph, I attached a single secure link to a redacted PDF document. It was a preliminary financial audit. Before I officially resigned, I had legally downloaded the company ledgers to protect myself from any liability regarding my father's reckless spending. The audit clearly mapped out the exact flow of corporate funds during the 2 weeks since Trent assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It showed the exact date and time the emergency payroll reserve was emptied and wired to a luxury jeweler's account. It highlighted the massive unauthorized withdrawals used to pay off personal luxury car leases. Most importantly, it tracked the incoming client deposits. It showed precisely how the massive catering retainers meant to secure premium ingredients were immediately diverted into offshore holding accounts, leaving the company completely incapable of purchasing food. I hit publish and closed the laptop. The shift in the public narrative was instantaneous and violent. Within an hour, the audit began circulating through the city's corporate networks. Event planners shared it. Financial analysts picked it up. It crossed over from LinkedIn to Twitter and then back to TikTok. The angry mob Jasmine had incited suddenly realized they had been lied to. The comments on her tearful video shifted from blind support to brutal interrogation. People started demanding to know why the CEO was buying $30,000 diamond rings with employee tax funds. The phrase disgruntled employee was quickly replaced by the phrase corporate embezzlement. I was sitting in my living room, sipping a glass of iced water and watching the chaotic fallout unfold when a unique notification popped up on my screen. A massive local lifestyle account had just reposted my LinkedIn audit. I clicked the profile and recognized the face instantly. It was Chloe Vance, the daughter of the state judge, and the bride whose high society wedding was currently collapsing because Heritage Elite had an illegal red-tagged kitchen and 0 premium ingredients. Chloe did not just share the audit. She posted a furious, scathing breakdown of the document. She had zoomed in on one specific line item, highlighting it in bright red digital ink. It was the record of her personal $50,000 catering deposit, the money she had paid just 10 days ago to secure Wagyu beef and organic truffles. My audit clearly showed that exact $50,000 sum entering the Heritage Elite account at 9 in the morning and being immediately transferred into Trent's private personal banking account by noon the exact same day. The bride's caption was short and absolutely merciless. She stated she was currently standing in a venue with 200 guests arriving tomorrow and no food because the CEO of her catering company had used her wedding money to fund his personal lifestyle. She publicly tagged the official accounts for Heritage Elite. Then she tagged the local investigative news station. Finally, she tagged the district attorney's office demanding an immediate investigation into wire fraud and grand larceny. The digital firestorm burned brighter and hotter as the evening progressed. Chloe Vance had essentially dropped a lit match into a powder keg. Local news anchors were already reposting her furious statements, and my phone notifications were an endless waterfall of sweet vindication. But inside my apartment, it was perfectly quiet. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and watched the rain begin to lash heavily against my living room windows. A fierce summer storm had rolled in quickly, bringing heavy driving sheets of water and rolling thunder that shook the glass panes. I felt entirely secure. My personal accounts were locked down, my new business LLC was legally bulletproof, and my conscience was crystal clear. I had warned them. I had tried to protect them. They chose to feed me to the wolves instead. It was nearly midnight when the heavy, frantic pounding started at my front door. It was not the polite, measured knock of a neighbor or the standard rap of a late delivery driver. It was desperate and aggressive. I walked slowly to the door, setting my tea down on the console table, and checked the security monitor mounted on the wall. I expected to see the local police or perhaps Trent trying to intimidate me in person into taking the financial audit down from my public profile. Instead, staring back at me through the grainy night vision camera lens was my father. Marcus stood on my welcome mat, completely drenched by the freezing rain. He was not wearing his signature custom-tailored suit or his expensive gold watch. He wore a rumpled tan trench coat that clung awkwardly to his broad shoulders, with dirty rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked incredibly small. The booming, terrifying patriarch who had dictated my entire existence, who had casually handed my life's work over to his favorite child, had vanished into the stormy night. In his place was an old, tired man shivering uncontrollably in the cold. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not step aside. I planted my feet firmly on the threshold, crossing my arms over my chest, keeping the warm, inviting light of my home strictly behind me. He looked up at me with red, bloodshot eyes. He reached out a trembling, wet hand, gripping the wooden doorframe tightly as if it was the absolute only thing keeping his legs from collapsing underneath him. He tried to offer his usual charming, commanding smile to smooth the tension, but his facial muscles simply would not cooperate. Tasha, he began, his voice raspy and completely stripped of all its usual booming thunder. Let me come inside, please. We need to sit down and talk about this as a family. We need to fix this right now before it goes any further. I did not move a single inch. I stared at his wet, desperate face and realized I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering desire to please him. There was no desperate need for his validation. There is no family left to fix Dad, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of warmth. You fixed it permanently when you handed the keys to my kitchen to a man who steals $50,000 deposits from brides. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his large head rapidly as the rain continued to pelt his back. He leaned forward, attempting to play the ultimate time-tested card of emotional manipulation. He aimed straight for my guilt. We are going to lose the house, Tasha, he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. Your mother is sick over this. She is lying in bed, hyperventilating and clutching her chest. The state health inspectors, the canceled vendor contracts, the judge's daughter tagging the district attorney on the internet. It is all crashing down around us. We are bleeding out, Tasha. Please come back to the company. We will make it right this time, I swear to God. We will give you 10% equity. 10%. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the offer hung in the freezing damp air between us. I had spent 12 years working 90-hour weeks, burning my arms on commercial ovens, sacrificing my youth, my personal credit, and my sanity to build Heritage Elite into a multi-million-dollar catering empire. I had been the executive chef, the lead accountant, the human resources director, and the perpetual crisis manager. And now, standing in the pouring rain, facing total financial annihilation and potential federal prison time, the absolute best my father could offer me was 10% of my own sweat and blood. I looked at the man who had raised me and felt a profound, liberating disgust. You gave a white man with a fake resume 50% of the company I built? I said every single word, hitting him like a physical blow. You handed him half of my legacy just because he wore a nice suit, threw around corporate buzzwords, and married your favorite daughter. You let him parade around my kitchen and disrespect me to my face in front of my own staff. You sat at a church pulpit and watched Mom pray for my downfall in front of the entire congregation. You do not want me back, Dad. You want your shield back. You want your human meat shield to step in front of the legal bullets you aimed directly at yourself. Marcus physically recoiled. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale ghost in the dim, amber porch light. He realized finally that his old psychological parlor tricks no longer worked. The dutiful, desperate approval-seeking daughter was dead. He let go of the doorframe and slumped heavily against the damp brick wall of my apartment building. He buried his face in his large, wet hands, his massive shoulders heaving with genuine, uncontrollable sobs. It is not just the catering business, he wept, the sound muffled by the pouring rain and his trembling fingers. It is worse, Tasha. It is so much worse than the company bank accounts. I kept my expression hard, refusing to offer him a single ounce of comfort or grace. Tell me, I demanded. Marcus slowly lowered his hands, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He bypassed my security protocols. Marcus confessed, his voice barely a whisper against the howling storm. When I made him the chief executive officer, I gave him my signature stamps to fast-track the municipal licenses. He used them for the bank instead. Trent took out a second massive commercial mortgage on the family home to cover his previous fraud settlements, and he drained all the equity. Your mother does not know. I stared at my father as the freezing rain washed over his face, mixing with his tears. The man who had commanded every room he entered, who had ruled my life with absolute unquestioned authority, was now just a terrified husband who had mortgaged his wife's sanctuary to fund a con artist. He begged me to help him hide the truth from Brenda. I told him to go home and confess before the bank sent the foreclosure notices. I closed my heavy front door, sliding the deadbolt into place and leaving him alone in the storm. The next morning, my phone rang precisely at 7. The caller identification displayed an unknown number, but the moment I accepted the call, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Trent. He was whispering, sounding breathless and frantic. The polished, arrogant chief executive officer persona had completely evaporated overnight. Tasha, listen to me. He started, his voice vibrating with barely contained panic. You have to pull that audit down right now. We can make a deal, you and me. We are the only two smart people in this entire miserable situation. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, pressing the phone closer to my ear. I did not say a word, letting the silence force him to keep talking. He took a shaky breath and launched into the most pathetic, desperate pitch I had ever heard in my professional career. Marcus is a sinking ship, Trent hissed into the receiver. He is completely financially illiterate, and he is going to take all of us down with him. I know you want your kitchen back. I know you want the company you built. I can give it to you. I will sign over all the remaining operational assets, and I will personally testify that Marcus committed gross financial negligence. I will throw him directly under the bus and hand you the keys to the kingdom. All you have to do is delete that audit and help me cover the tracks on those vendor wire transfers. We can say it was an accounting error. We can fix this, Tasha. I took a slow sip of my dark roast. You want me to help you cover up felony embezzlement in exchange for a bankrupt company, Trent? It is a business decision, he urged, his tone turning sleazy and conspiratorial. You hate them as much as I do right now. They threw you out. Let me help you destroy them. I do not discuss federal financial crimes over unsecured cellular lines. I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Meet me at the Roasting Cooperative downtown at noon. Bring all of your corporate access credentials. We will discuss the terms of your surrender in person. I ended the call before he could say another word. I dressed carefully, choosing a sharp, tailored blazer and my most intimidating heels. I arrived at the coffee shop at 11:30, securing a quiet table in the back corner. The cooperative was loud and bustling, filled with freelance designers and tech workers typing furiously on their laptops. It was the perfect cover noise. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single text message to my mother Brenda and my sister Jasmine. If you want to know exactly where the wedding deposits and the equity in your house went, dial into this conference line in 5 minutes. Remain entirely muted, do not make a single sound. I dialed into the secure conference bridge and waited. 2 silent digital pings indicated that 2 callers had joined the line. I placed my phone deep inside my structured leather tote bag, ensuring the microphone was pointing directly out toward the empty chair across from me. I left the speaker feature activated, but dialed the volume down to 0. Trent walked through the front doors at exactly noon. He looked completely unraveled. His designer suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and he had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. He scanned the room, spotted me in the corner, and practically sprinted over to the table. He threw his leather briefcase onto the floor and dropped into the chair, leaning in so close I could smell the stale alcohol sweating out of his pores. "You brought the access codes?" I asked, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. He nodded frantically, tapping his fingers on the wooden table. "I have everything. The banking tokens, the vendor passwords, the municipal permits. I will give it all to you, Tasha. Just tell me you deleted the public audit." Before we finalize any transfer, I said, keeping my voice just loud enough to clearly register on the hidden phone microphone. "I need to know exactly why I should protect you, and let my own flesh and blood take the fall for your offshore accounts. Why should I help you, Trent?" He let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He took the bait so easily it was almost embarrassing. "Because your family is a joke, Tasha." He sneered, his arrogance flaring up to mask his terror. "They deserve to lose everything. Marcus and Brenda are gullible fools. They handed me the keys to a multi-million-dollar enterprise just because I wore a Rolex, drove a leased Porsche, and smiled at their stupid country club dinners. They were so desperate for a corporate savior, they did not even verify my background. It was pathetic how easy it was to bleed their accounts dry." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "And what about your wife, Trent? What about Jasmine?" He rolled his eyes, groaning in pure disgust. "Jasmine is a clueless, spoiled liability. She cares more about her social media analytics and Instagram filters than profit and loss statements. She is a useful idiot, Tasha. I only married her because she was the easiest way into the family bank accounts. She spends half her day shopping and the other half complaining. I was planning to file for divorce and leave her saddled with the corporate debt the moment the offshore transfers cleared." Trent was right in the middle of detailing exactly how he had manipulated the commercial mortgage paperwork when the front door of the coffee shop slammed open with enough force to rattle the front windows. The entire bustling room fell completely silent. Dozens of patrons looked up from their screens. I did not have to turn my head to know who had just arrived. I could hear the aggressive, furious clicking of her designer heels marching across the polished concrete floor. Jasmine did not look like an influencer today. She looked like an absolute executioner. She was not holding her phone. She was gripping a massive 20-ounce iced latte, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She marched straight through the maze of tables, ignoring the staring crowd. She stopped directly beside our table. Trent looked up, his jaw dropping open. The color vanished from his face as he stared at his wife. "Jasmine, honey," he stammered, his voice squeaking in terror. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine did not say a single word. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply locked eyes with the man who had just called her a clueless liability and hurled the entire contents of the plastic cup directly into his face. The heavy impact of the ice cubes and the cold milk shattered against his face and completely ruined his expensive Italian suit. Trent gasped, sputtering and wiping the sticky liquid from his eyes as it dripped down his chin and soaked into his collar. Jasmine stood over him, staring at the dripping, pathetic mess of a man she had married. She dropped the empty plastic cup onto the table where it rattled against the wood. "My lawyer is calling the district attorney, Trent," she said, her voice echoing clearly through the dead-silent coffee shop. "And Brenda is calling the bank. You are going to prison." I watched Jasmine turn on her heel and march out of the coffee shop, leaving a dripping, terrified Trent frozen in the middle of the room. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. but I simply picked up my structured leather tote bag and walked out the back door. I had exactly what I needed, and Heritage Elite was finally out of time. By Monday morning, the corporate bloodbath was official. The bank did not just freeze the Heritage Elite accounts, they dropped the guillotine. A team of forensic auditors descended on the main office, and what they found in the ledgers triggered an immediate cascade of default notices. The master commercial kitchen, the beating heart of the empire I had built from scratch, was slapped with heavy steel padlocks and bright neon bank seizure notices. The fleet of refrigerated delivery vans were repossessed before noon, towed away right in front of the kitchen staff who had shown up hoping for a final paycheck. Heritage Elite was completely and legally bankrupt. Every single corporate asset was locked down to cover the massive black hole Trent had blown into the company finances. The collapse destroyed my family's personal lives with the exact same ruthless efficiency. Brenda became a total recluse overnight. The woman who had spent the last decade treating her church congregation like a personal royal court suddenly refused to answer her phone. She disconnected the landline, drew the heavy custom drapes in her pristine living room, and hid in the dark. The local society pages and regional gossip blogs were having an absolute field day with the scandal. Everyone in her elite social circle knew that her brilliant new son-in-law had drained the company and secretly leveraged her precious family home to the absolute brink of foreclosure. She could not bear to show her face at Sunday service knowing the entire congregation was whispering about how she had publicly prayed for my downfall while proudly welcoming a silver-tongued con artist into her dining room. Trent fared even worse. The arrogant corporate savior who had sneered at my calloused hands realized the district attorney was perfectly serious about the impending wire fraud charges. In a final act of pure unadulterated cowardice, he attempted to flee the state. He packed a pair of designer duffel bags, abandoned his ruined luxury car, and booked a red-eye flight out of the municipal airport. He did not make it past the security checkpoint. The commercial bank had already flagged his biometric credentials, and the airport authorities intercepted him right at the gate. They pulled him out of the boarding line, confiscated his passport, and informed him he was a designated flight risk. He was completely trapped, grounded in the city, while the Financial Crimes Unit systematically dismantled his fake resume and traced his offshore holding accounts. Marcus was left to navigate the smoking wreckage of his legacy alone. The proud, defiant patriarch, who had demanded my absolute loyalty, was now facing total ruin. The commercial bank was actively preparing to auction off the kitchen equipment for pennies on the dollar, and the foreclosure on the family home was moving forward with terrifying speed. He was looking at a miserable retirement stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his power. He spent his days sitting in his corporate lawyer's office, staring blankly at the mounting pile of civil lawsuits and criminal liability notices. Then on Thursday afternoon, a miracle materialized out of the corporate ether. I received the update from my own legal counsel, just as Marcus's lawyer was presenting the lifeline to my father. A private equity firm operating under the name Apex Solutions had formally reached out to the banking institution managing the Heritage Elite bankruptcy. Apex Solutions specialized in acquiring distressed culinary and hospitality assets. They had reviewed the company's remaining portfolio and submitted a hard cash offer to buy out the entire operation. It was a brutally aggressive lowball offer. Apex Solutions was proposing to purchase the master kitchen, the remaining equipment, the active vendor contracts, and the brand name for a fraction of what the company had been worth just a month prior. It was an insulting number that completely erased any profit margin Marcus had ever hoped to retire on. But the offer came with one massive, undeniable benefit. The cash buyout was exactly enough to satisfy the commercial bank debt, pay off the fraudulent second mortgage Trent had taken out on the family home, and officially close the criminal liability loophole regarding the missing corporate funds. It would leave Marcus with absolutely zero equity, but it would save him from a federal indictment and keep a roof over Brenda's head. Marcus did not even have the leverage to negotiate. He was staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and Apex Solutions was offering him a bulletproof vest. He sat in his attorney's leather chair, his thick hands trembling as he read over the preliminary acquisition documents. The contract required him to forfeit all controlling interest, completely dissolving his authority and handing the entire physical infrastructure of Heritage Elite over to the private equity group. He picked up a heavy brass pen and signed his name on the dotted line, surrendering the empire he had effectively stolen from me. He pushed the documents across the mahogany desk, his face pale and completely defeated. His lawyer carefully gathered the signed papers, tapping them against the desk to straighten the edges. He looked at Marcus with a tight, professional smile. "The preliminary transfer is complete, Marcus. The bank has agreed to halt the foreclosure proceedings based on this signed intent to sell." Marcus nodded slowly, rubbing his bloodshot eyes with the palms of his hands. "When do we finalize?" he asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. "When do I get the official clearance?" The lawyer slipped the documents into a manila envelope. The legal team for Apex Solutions has already processed the wire transfers. Their chief executive officer will be arriving at this office tomorrow morning at 9 sharp to execute the final signatures and take formal physical possession of the company. Make sure you are not late, Marcus. They want to look you in the eye when they take the keys. The 42nd floor of the Sterling and Vance law firm was a fortress of glass steel and frozen air conditioning. It was designed to make people feel small, and it was working perfectly. Marcus sat at the very edge of the massive mahogany conference table, staring blankly at his own distorted reflection in the polished wood. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of the man he had been just a week ago. Next to him, Brenda sat rigid and perfectly still. She was wearing a black cashmere sweater and massive dark sunglasses indoors, desperately trying to hide her swollen, bloodshot eyes. She had barely spoken a single word since the moment she realized her pristine social standing had been completely incinerated. Across the table, Jasmine and Trent sat as far apart as the physical space would allow. The marriage was entirely dead, existing only as a legal formality until the criminal liability was officially sorted out. Jasmine was aggressively chewing on her thumbnail, her usual glamorous aura replaced by a toxic cloud of bitter resentment. Trent sported a faint yellowish bruise along his jawline, but amazingly his posture was slowly beginning to revert to its usual arrogant slouch. Despite the absolute devastation that had rained down upon them, there was a sickening, palpable undercurrent of relief vibrating in the room. They were battered, humiliated, and completely broke, but they had survived the blast radius. The private equity bailout meant the bank was getting their money, and the district attorney was dropping the fraud investigation. Brenda was keeping her beloved suburban mansion, and Marcus was staying out of a federal penitentiary. They were about to sign away the total sum of their life's work to a faceless corporation, but to them it felt like a miraculous escape. They just had to hand over the corpse of Heritage Elite, and they could walk away. Trent shifted in his expensive leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. He looked around the sterile room, his narcissistic brain rapidly spinning a narrative that would absolve him of all responsibility. He could not accept that he had destroyed the company. He needed to believe he had simply executed a high-level corporate strategy that they were too ignorant to understand. He cleared his throat, breaking the suffocating silence. "This is not a total loss," Trent announced, his voice slowly regaining its familiar patronizing edge. "I know things got slightly chaotic at the end, but you have to look at the bigger picture here, Marcus." Marcus slowly lifted his head, his eyes burning with pure exhaustion. "Do not speak to me, Trent. Do not open your mouth." Trent ignored the warning, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He actually smiled a small, smug grin that made Jasmine physically recoil in disgust. "See," he continued, pushing his luck with staggering audacity. "I told you my financial maneuvering would attract private equity. This is exactly how the modern corporate world works. We trim the fat, we leverage the heavy assets, and we draw in the big players. We secured a massive cash buyout in record time. Most failing companies beg for an exit strategy like this. We will bounce back from this minor setback. Give it a year, let the heat die down, and we will launch a new venture." Jasmine let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "You are completely delusional," she spat, glaring at him from behind her hair. "You did not secure an exit strategy, you idiot. You panicked and almost lost my mother's house. Brenda let out a sharp hiss, snapping her fingers at both of them. "Be quiet," she demanded, her voice shaking with stress. "Both of you just shut up and sit still so we can sign these papers and leave this miserable building." Trent rolled his eyes, leaning back and crossing his legs at the ankle. He was determined to have the last word to prove that he was still the smartest person in the room. He turned his attention to his favorite target, deciding to elevate his own ego by trampling on my memory. "We are walking away clean," Trent gloated, adjusting his tie. "We secured a multi-million-dollar buyout." Meanwhile, Tasha threw a temper tantrum, blew up her own career, and walked away with absolutely zero. She thought she was so vital to the operation, but look where it got her. She is completely unemployable in this city now. I guarantee she is probably working a drive-through window right now, pouring stale coffee for minimum wage. Marcus did not answer him. He simply turned his head and stared at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, ticking away the final seconds of his reign. It was exactly 1 minute to 9. The silence in the room stretched out thick and heavy, suffocating the final remnants of Trent's pathetic gloating. As the clock struck 9, the heavy oak double doors at the end of the conference room unlatched with a loud, echoing click. The bank's lead attorney, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, instantly stood up. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket and gestured toward the open doorway with deep professional reverence. "Good morning, everyone," the attorney announced, his voice crisp and cutting through the dead air. "I appreciate your punctuality today. The transaction funds have successfully cleared escrow. Let me introduce the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of Apex Solutions." I stepped through the heavy oak doors. I was not wearing chef whites or a flour-dusted apron. I was not covered in the scent of roasted garlic and burnt sugar. I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal designer suit that fit me like a suit of armor. My hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate twist, and I wore a pair of black Christian Louboutin heels that clicked against the polished hardwood floor like the cocking of a loaded gun. Flanking me on either side, moving in perfect synchronization, were two of the most expensive and ruthless corporate litigators in the state. They carried thick leather briefcases filled with the transfer deeds, the asset schedules, and the absolute ownership rights to everything my family had ever possessed. I walked directly to the head of the mahogany table. I looked down at Marcus, then at Brenda, then at Jasmine, and finally at Trent, whose smug smile had instantly dissolved into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice echoing like ice in the frozen room. "Let us get down to business." The heavy brass pen slipped from Marcus's fingers. It clattered loudly against the polished mahogany, bouncing twice before rolling off the edge and hitting the floor. That small metallic thud was the only sound in the entire room. Pure, unadulterated shock paralyzed every single person at the table. Brenda ripped her massive dark sunglasses off her face, her eyes bulging as if the sterile boardroom lighting was playing a cruel trick on her. Jasmine slapped both hands over her mouth, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her cheeks as she let out a muffled, strangled gasp. Trent looked as though the floor had simply vanished beneath his feet. His smug, arrogant posture collapsed instantly, leaving him slumped in his expensive leather chair like a deflated balloon. I did not break eye contact with my father as I walked slowly around the massive conference table. The bank's attorney immediately vacated the oversized executive chair at the head of the table, offering it to me with a respectful, deferential nod. I sat down methodically, smoothing the line of my blazer, while my two litigators took their positions standing directly behind my shoulders like sentinels. "You wanted a corporate savior, Dad?" I asked, leaning back in the chair. "Here I am. You spent 12 years treating me like a glorified kitchen servant. You ignored my profit margins. You dismissed my operational strategies, and you handed my legacy over to a fraud simply because he wore a nice suit and played golf. You wanted ruthless corporate maneuvering. So I bought a suit and I maneuvered." Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face was a sickly shade of gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stared at me as if he was looking at a complete stranger. Brenda was the first to attempt to break the tension. She practically launched herself forward, leaning across the table with a frantic, desperate smile plastering her face. Tasha, honey, she cried out, her voice trembling with forced maternal warmth. This is a miracle. You set this up to save the family business. You bought the debt to keep it in the family. We can put this all behind us right now and go back to the way things were. I looked at the woman who had sat in a church pew and prayed for my failure. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, liberating clarity. I did not save the family, Brenda. I replied, my tone completely flat and merciless. I bought the assets. I took the massive catering contracts that followed me when Marcus fired me, and I funneled every cent of that profit into forming Apex Solutions. I sat back and watched Trent systematically destroy your cash flow. The moment the commercial bank panicked over his gross negligence, I swooped in. I purchased your toxic commercial debt for absolute pennies on the dollar. I nodded to the litigator standing over my right shoulder. He unzipped a thick leather portfolio and extracted the final binding transfer agreement. He placed it face up on the table and slid it precisely across the polished wood until it came to a halt directly in front of Marcus. Look at the paperwork, Dad, I commanded. Read the terms. I own the master commercial kitchen. I own the entire fleet of refrigerated delivery trucks. I own every single municipal permit, the vendor supply chains, and the brand name. Sign that final executive release right now, and the bank will not seize your personal home. You get to keep the roof over your head and you get to stay out of a federal penitentiary. But Heritage Elite is dead. It is my company now. Marcus stared down at the documents, his hands trembling so violently he could not even pick up the paper. The realization of his total defeat was suffocating him. He had lost his company, his fortune, and his absolute authority to the daughter he had thrown away. Suddenly, Trent slammed his hands down on the table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. The shock had finally worn off, leaving him cornered, desperate and frantic. His fragile, narcissistic ego simply could not process the reality of being completely outsmarted. I am not signing anything! Trent screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at me. This is a massive scam. She manipulated the commercial bank. I am the legal chief executive officer of this company, and I have executive rights. We are not surrendering to her. I will call my own attorneys right now. I will tie this illegal hostile takeover up in corporate litigation for the next 10 years. You will never touch those kitchens, Tasha. Jasmine grabbed his arm, terrified by his outburst, but he violently shook her off. He stood up, chest heaving, glaring down the length of the table at me. He was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead as he prepared to launch into another pathetic tirade about his corporate superiority. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply turned my head slightly and nodded to the litigator standing over my left shoulder. The lawyer stepped forward, moving with practiced, terrifying precision. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a thick, sealed manila envelope. He placed it on the table and slid it directly toward Trent. It bumped gently against Trent's coffee cup. Open it, I instructed, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Trent stared at the envelope, his chest heaving. He reached out with trembling fingers, ripping the paper seal and pulling out the stack of documents inside. His eyes scanned the first page, and all the false bravado completely drained from his body. His knees buckled, and he fell heavily back into his chair. It was a fully drafted, comprehensive police report. My forensic accountants had spent the last week pulling apart his digital footprint. The pages contained every single wire fraud transaction, every illegal offshore account transfer, and every forged corporate signature Trent had executed over the last 30 days. It was a flawless roadmap to a 20-year federal prison sentence. Trent stared down at the meticulously compiled evidence of his own destruction. His eyes darted frantically across the crisp white pages, reading the itemized lists of his wire transfers, the precise timestamps of his offshore routing, and the undeniable proof of his forged signatures. The thick, polished corporate armor he had worn for the past year was melting right off his body. His chest began to heave, and a thick sheen of cold sweat broke out across his pale forehead. He looked up at my litigators, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but they simply stared back at him with the cold, dead eyes of absolute corporate executioners. He had no leverage. He had no escape route. The bank had locked him out, the airport security had flagged him, and now I was holding the final nail for his coffin. The silence in the massive boardroom was agonizing. Marcus and Brenda watched the scene unfold with terrified fascination, completely unable to comprehend how the golden boy they had worshipped was unspooling in front of them. Jasmine sat frozen, her hands still clamped over her mouth, watching her husband disintegrate. Then Trent snapped. The realization that he had been completely and totally outsmarted by the woman he had treated like a kitchen servant fractured his fragile, narcissistic ego into a million jagged pieces. He threw the police report across the mahogany table, where the pages scattered and slid across the polished wood. He pushed himself up from his heavy leather chair, his face contorting into a mask of pure feral rage. The suave, charming country club persona evaporated entirely, leaving behind nothing but the ugly, venomous core of who he truly was. "You think you won?" He spat, his voice trembling with a high-pitched, hysterical fury. "You think putting on a tailored suit and hiring a couple of expensive suits makes you my equal?" I did not move a single inch. I sat perfectly still, folding my hands neatly on the table in front of me, allowing him the absolute freedom to hang himself with his own words. "You are nothing," Trent screamed, slamming his fist down on the table and pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are a glorified line cook. I lowered myself to work with you people. I lowered myself to walk into that kitchen and pretend you actually belonged in the same corporate atmosphere as me. I did you a favor by taking over this pathetic, struggling company." He turned his vicious, bloodshot eyes toward Marcus. The old man was sitting completely paralyzed, staring up at the son-in-law he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. "And you," Trent sneered, his upper lip curling in pure, unfiltered disgust, "you were the easiest mark I have ever met in my entire life. You were so pathetic, so desperate for validation from a real businessman that you practically begged me to take your bank accounts. You wanted a white face to parade around your stupid country club dinners to validate your little catering hustle to the elite. You played right into my hands because you are nothing but an ignorant, arrogant fool playing dress-up in a white man's world." The deep, deeply ingrained bigotry that he had kept hidden behind his charming smiles and expensive watches suddenly erupted. Cornered and stripped of his power, Trent unleashed a vile string of racially charged insults. He screamed that we were street trash, that we had no business operating in the high-level financial sector, and that he was entirely justified in stealing our money because we were too stupid to manage it ourselves. The sheer unadulterated racism echoed off the glass walls of the sterile boardroom, toxic and heavy. Brenda physically recoiled, pressing her back against her chair as if she had been slapped. The man she had welcomed into her home, the man she had proudly shown off to her church congregation, was standing in a high-rise law firm screaming racial slurs at her husband. Marcus reached his breaking point. The devastating realization of his own foolishness, combined with the vile racist disrespect being hurled at his family, finally shattered his paralysis. A deep, guttural roar of pure protective fury tore out of his throat. He pushed his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the floor. Marcus lunged forward, his massive hands reaching across the mahogany table, aiming directly for Trent's throat. I raised my right hand palm, facing outward. "Stop," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute weight of total authority. Marcus froze. He hovered halfway across the table, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles were stark white, his chest heaving with rage. He looked at me, his eyes burning with tears of absolute humiliation and fury. "Do not dirty your hands, Dad," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "Look at him. He is a coward and a thief, and he is completely broken. Do not give him the satisfaction of making you lose your composure. Let the trash take itself out." Marcus stared at me for a long, heavy second. He saw the cold, calculated control in my eyes and recognized that I had already exacted a vengeance far worse than anything he could do with his fists. Slowly, Marcus lowered his hands and stepped back from the table, his heavy shoulders slumping in defeat. I turned my gaze to the far end of the table. Jasmine was sitting absolutely still, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. The glamorous illusion of her high society marriage had been violently ripped away. She was looking up at Trent, her eyes wide with horror, and devastating realization. She had betrayed her own sister, alienated her family, and spent the last year defending a man who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient bank account and a racial prop. She finally saw the racist, opportunistic monster she had married. Trent caught her looking at him. He did not offer a single word of apology or comfort. He looked at his weeping wife with the exact same expression of profound disgust he had just aimed at her father. "Do not look at me like that," Trent snapped, his voice dripping with venom. "You were the easiest part of the entire scam. You cost me a few expensive dinners and a shiny ring, and you handed me the keys to the vault. You are just as stupid as your father." Jasmine let out a sharp, agonizing sob, burying her face in her hands. Trent looked around the room, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically from my litigators to the bank's attorney who was already dialing a number on his cell phone. The reality of his impending arrest finally crashed down over him. He spun around, practically tripping over his own feet, and bolted for the heavy oak doors. He shoved them open and fled down the long, sterile hallway, abandoning his wife, his ruined reputation, and his freedom. I did not even turn my head to watch him run. I picked up the solid brass pen Marcus had dropped, smoothed out the final transfer agreement, and tapped the tip of the pen against the signature line. "Now," I said, looking directly into my father's eyes, "sign my company over to me." Marcus reached for the brass pen with a hand that trembled like a dry leaf in a winter storm. He pressed the nib to the heavy paper, and the scratching sound of his signature echoed through the cavernous room. He did not read the terms again. He simply dragged his name across the dotted line, surrendering his empire, his legacy, and his pride in one jagged stroke. The moment he lifted the pen, my lead litigator smoothly slid the document across the mahogany table, placing it directly into my hands. I looked down at the dark blue ink. It was dry. The transaction was absolute and legally binding. I stood up slowly, the leather of the executive chair creaking in the dead silence. I buttoned the center button of my charcoal suit jacket and looked down at the three people who had spent my entire life making me feel small, invisible, and worthless. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely obliterated. As the new owner of this enterprise, I announced, my voice slicing through the frozen air like a scalpel. "I am initiating an immediate corporate restructuring to salvage whatever value remains in this brand. Marcus, Brenda, Jasmine, you are all officially terminated effective immediately." Brenda let out a sharp, choking gasp, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. "You cannot do this," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a mixture of terror and entitlement. "We are your family. I am your mother. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. We built this company." "You built nothing, Brenda," I replied, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "You spent 12 years reaping the financial rewards of my grueling labor, and then you handed the keys to a criminal because he fit your aesthetic. You lost this company the second you voted me out. I am simply the new management taking out the trash." Marcus did not say a word. He remained slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the spot on the table where the contract had been. The reality of his catastrophic failure had completely broken him. But Jasmine was unraveling at a terrifying speed. The absolute devastation of her reality was crashing down on her all at once. Trent had just fled the building, abandoning her to face a federal fraud investigation. Her fake high society marriage was over. Her personal bank accounts had been drained by her fleeing husband. And now her family wealth had just been legally transferred to the sister she despised. Jasmine shoved her chair back and scrambled to her feet. She stumbled around the edge of the massive table, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She practically threw herself toward me, stopping only when my litigators took a sharp, protective step forward. "Tasha, please," Jasmine begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate sob. "You cannot do this to me. I have absolutely nothing left. Trent took all the liquid cash from our joint accounts. I cannot pay the mortgage on our condo. I cannot even afford my divorce attorney. I am going to be ruined." I stared at her tear-streaked face, noting how quickly her arrogant sneer had morphed into pathetic begging. "I can work for you," Jasmine pleaded, tears spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. I can do the social media for the new brand. I can run the marketing accounts. I will even be a receptionist, Tasha. I will sit at the front desk and answer the phones. Just please give me a job. I am your sister. You cannot leave me with nothing. The word sister hung in the air, heavy with years of toxic hypocrisy. I looked at the woman who had mocked my flour-dusted clothes, who had laughed when our father fired me, who had proudly worn a diamond ring bought with the money I had generated. I searched myself for even a single drop of pity or familial loyalty and found absolutely nothing but cold, hard steel. "You are not a sister, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling octave that made her physically recoil. "You are a parasite. You are a parasite who actually believed that a pretty face and a borrowed credit card could somehow replace 12 years of my blood sweat and burnt skin. You spent your entire adult life looking down on the kitchen, acting as though the actual work of running a business was beneath you. You do not know how to work. You only know how to take." Jasmine opened her mouth to argue, to launch another desperate plea, but the words died in her throat under the crushing weight of my stare. "We are completely done here," I announced, stepping back from the table. I looked toward the heavy oak doors where two massive security guards employed by the building management had already been positioned by my legal team. "Security," I called out, my voice ringing with total authority. "Escort these 3 former employees off my property immediately. They are no longer authorized to be in this building." The guards stepped into the room, their presence large and uncompromising. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic wail, clinging to Marcus's arm as he slowly, heavily dragged himself to his feet. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. Jasmine stood frozen, tears pouring down her face, her entire body trembling with the shock of her new reality. The guards moved in, gesturing firmly toward the exit. Marcus and Brenda began a slow, humiliating shuffle toward the door, completely stripped of their pride and their power. Jasmine followed behind them, her head bowed, her sobs echoing in the quiet room. They were halfway down the corridor when I stepped out of the boardroom to watch them leave. The absolute silence of their defeat was intoxicating, but there was one final loose end to tie up. One last thing, I called out. Marcus, Brenda, and Jasmine stopped in their tracks. They turned to look back at me, standing at the head of the hallway, a picture of total corporate dominance. "Those luxury SUVs you all drove here today," I stated, leaning casually against the doorframe. "They are legally registered under the Heritage Elite corporate account, which means they are now my personal property. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the vehicles and return the keys to my front desk. If they are not parked in my company lot by Wednesday morning, I will immediately report them stolen to the police." I did not wait for their reaction. I stepped back into my boardroom and let the heavy oak doors click shut. The sound of the latch engaging echoed through the empty boardroom with absolute finality. I walked back to the head of the table and sank into the leather executive chair. The air in the room finally felt breathable. The bank's attorney finished organizing his files, snapped his briefcase shut, and offered a firm, professional nod before exiting through the side door. My 2 litigators remained silently gathering the executed transfer agreements and the printed police report that Trent had abandoned in his frantic escape. The empire that Marcus had built on my back, the legacy Brenda had used to secure her country club status, and the wealth Jasmine had paraded around like a royal title, all of it was now secured inside a standard manila envelope resting on the mahogany table. Down in the lobby, the reality of their termination was physically manifesting. Marcus stumbled out of the private executive elevator, leaning heavily on Brenda. He moved like an old, fragile man stripped of the aggressive posture he had used to intimidate his staff for decades. Brenda's face was flushed a blotchy, uneven red. She clutched her designer handbag to her chest, her eyes darting around the marble lobby, terrified that the building's security guards or the reception staff might notice their disgrace. Jasmine walked a few paces behind them, completely silent. Her phone was pressed to her ear as she desperately tried to reach Trent, but every call went straight to voicemail. She was a woman waking up from a long, expensive dream to find herself standing on the edge of a cliff. They walked through the revolving glass doors and out into the harsh morning sunlight. The valet brought around their vehicles. Marcus slid into his black Mercedes SUV, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it was the last piece of property he actually owned. Brenda climbed into the passenger seat, refusing to look at the valet. Jasmine got into her pristine white Range Rover, the car she had bought the week she was promoted to Vice President of Marketing, a title that no longer existed. They drove away from the Sterling and Vance building, not as executives, but as trespassers, who had been given exactly 48 hours to surrender their last remaining symbols of wealth. Back upstairs, I stood up from the table and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city traffic below. I allowed myself exactly 1 minute of silence to absorb the victory. There was no champagne, no grand celebration. The real work was just beginning. I turned away from the window and headed for the door. It was time to go home to the real heart of the operation. 30 minutes later, my driver pulled up to the massive industrial complex that housed the Heritage Elite Master Kitchens. The facility spanned an entire city block, a labyrinth of stainless steel prep stations, walk-in freezers, and loading docks. This was the engine that powered the catering empire. As I walked through the double doors, the familiar scent of roasted garlic, simmering stock, and fresh herbs washed over me. The kitchen was operating at full capacity, a symphony of chopping, searing, and shouting. The staff moved with frantic, exhausted energy, trying to keep up with the impossible quotas Trent had implemented before he fled. I walked directly to the center of the main prep floor. A few of the line cooks noticed me and stopped, their knives hovering mid-air. The sous chefs turned around, their expressions shifting from exhaustion to confusion. I had been banned from this building a year ago, escorted out by the very security guards Marcus had hired to enforce my exile. Now I was standing in the very center of the room, wearing a tailored charcoal suit instead of my stained chef whites. "Turn off the stoves!" I announced, my voice carrying easily over the roar of the ventilation hoods. "Shut down the lines and gather around." The executive chef, a man Trent had hired specifically to replace me, stepped forward, wiping his hands on a towel. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You are not authorized to be on this floor. We have 3 corporate luncheons to push out by noon. I need you to leave before I call management." "I am management," I replied, my gaze locking onto his. "In fact, I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of this facility. Marcus and Trent are gone. They have been officially terminated. This brand now belongs to Apex Solutions. Pack your knives. You are fired." The executive chef scoffed, crossing his arms. "You cannot fire me. I have a contract with Trent." "Trent is currently fleeing a federal fraud indictment," I stated plainly, not breaking eye contact. "Your contract is void. Security will escort you to the lockers." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as 2 of my newly hired security personnel stepped forward and escorted the stunned chef off the floor. The remaining staff stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Many of them were my old crew, people I had trained, mentored, and worked alongside for 12 grueling years. They looked at me with a mixture of hope and disbelief. I turned to face them. "The impossible quotas are gone," I announced. "The cheap ingredients Trent forced you to use are going in the trash. We are restructuring this entire operation starting right now. We are going back to the quality and the standards that actually built this company. Everyone currently standing on this floor is receiving an immediate 20% raise to compensate for the unpaid overtime you were forced to work under previous management." A collective gasp echoed through the stainless steel room, followed by a sudden explosive cheer. The line cooks applauded, clapping their hands against the metal prep tables. The tension that had suffocated the facility for the past year instantly evaporated, replaced by a fierce, loyal energy. I was not just a corporate suit taking over a spreadsheet. I was their chef, and I had come back to reclaim my kitchen. Over the next 48 hours, the systematic dismantling of my family's false reality was executed with flawless precision. Jasmine returned to her luxury condo, only to find that Trent had indeed cleaned out the safe, taken her expensive jewelry, and left her with a stack of unpaid credit card bills. She was completely isolated, having burned every bridge and alienated every friend to impress a man who viewed her as a temporary asset. Marcus and Brenda barricaded themselves inside their suburban mansion, refusing to answer the phone or speak to their neighbors. The illusion of their superiority had been shattered, and they were left sitting in a quiet, empty house, realizing that their greed had cost them everything. By Wednesday morning, precisely at 9 o'clock, my front desk receptionist buzzed my office. 2 flatbed tow trucks were parked in the company lot. The repo team I had hired was unloading a black Mercedes SUV and a white Range Rover. Marcus and Jasmine had surrendered the vehicles, quietly leaving the keys on the driver's seats. They had nothing left to fight with. The eviction was complete, and the empire was mine. 2 weeks later, the massive moving trucks arrived at the sprawling suburban estate, but they were not the premium white-glove relocation specialists Marcus and Brenda usually employed. They were a discount local crew, hurriedly tossing boxes into the back of a rented van. Marcus and Brenda sat in the cramped living area of a modest 2-bedroom rental on the far outskirts of the city. The silence in the small house was absolutely deafening. There were no caterers rushing through the halls, no high society friends dropping by for cocktails, and no phones ringing with lucrative business offers. Brenda sat on a cheap fabric sofa, staring blankly at a cardboard box labeled kitchen decor. She did not have the energy to unpack it. Her country club memberships had been instantly revoked. Her premium credit cards were frozen, and her social currency had been completely and permanently annihilated. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of effortless superiority, only to end up in a cramped duplex, hiding from the grocery store cashiers who had seen her public disgrace at church. Marcus sat across from her in a worn armchair. He looked down at his hands, calloused from decades of building a business that he had voluntarily handed over to a con artist. He realized with sickening, devastating clarity that his desperate obsession with proximity to wealth, his pathetic need to be validated by the elite, had cost him the only legacy that actually mattered. He had traded his brilliant, intensely loyal daughter for a racist illusion. The guilt gnawed at the lining of his stomach until he could no longer sit in that suffocating little house. He needed to see her. He needed to look Tasha in the eye. Marcus drove his 10-year-old practical sedan to the newly rebranded headquarters of Apex Solutions. Pulling into the expansive corporate lot, he hardly recognized the place. The crumbling asphalt had been entirely repaved. The delivery fleet was fully upgraded, gleaming white refrigerated trucks, bearing a sleek modern logo, lined up with military precision. Inside the massive glass lobby, the building buzzed with an intense, focused energy. Phones rang steadily, dispatchers coordinated massive corporate accounts, and staff moved with a brisk, cheerful efficiency that had been completely absent during his final years of management. He cautiously approached the front reception desk, a place where he used to command immediate, terrified obedience. Now the young receptionist simply asked for his name and politely instructed him to take a seat in the waiting area. Marcus sat on a sleek leather bench for 45 minutes. He watched dozens of employees walking past, clutching clipboards and tablets, all speaking to each other with a profound, reverent respect for their new CEO. They did not fear Tasha the way they had feared him. They believed in her. Finally, he was ushered down the main corridor and into the executive corner office. Tasha was sitting behind a massive, polished glass desk, reviewing a stack of digital supply contracts. She looked up as the door opened. She did not look angry. She looked entirely in her element, vibrating with a quiet, absolute authority. Marcus stepped into the room, his heavy shoulders slumped, his pride entirely stripped away. He stood before the desk, suddenly feeling incredibly small in the presence of his own child. "Tasha," he began, his voice thick with a rough, unfamiliar humility. "Sit down, Marcus," she said calmly, gesturing to the chair opposite her. He sank into the chair, gripping his knees tightly. He looked out through the glass walls of her office at the vast, thriving operation, then looked back at his daughter. "I was a fool," he said, the words tearing out of his throat. "A blind, arrogant fool. I built that catering business from the ground up, but I never felt like I truly belonged in the rooms we were serving. I wanted to be part of that world so desperately. When Trent came along with his country club pedigree and his connections, he looked like everything I thought success was supposed to be." Marcus leaned forward, tears welling up in his exhausted eyes. "I was intimidated by your brilliance, Tasha. You knew the business better than I ever did. But my ego could not accept it. I let myself be blinded by his whiteness, by his smooth talk, by the shiny illusion of the corporate elite. I threw away my own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that never wanted me anyway. I allowed that racist parasite to humiliate you because I was too weak to stand up for my own daughter. Tasha listened in absolute silence. She watched the tears spill over her father's eyelids. She saw the genuine agonizing remorse etching deep lines into his aging face. He was not making excuses. He was not trying to shift the blame to Trent or Brenda. He was finally completely awake to the devastating reality of his own actions. "I am so incredibly sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "I am sorry for not protecting you. I am sorry for handing your birthright to a predator. I do not expect anything from you. I do not want a job. I just need you to know that I see exactly what I did to you, and I have to live with that shame for the rest of my life." Tasha closed the digital file on her desk and folded her hands. The furious burning anger that had fueled her for the past year, the intense need to prove him wrong, had fully dissipated. She had already won. She had rebuilt the empire, secured her wealth, and exposed the frauds. There was no need for cruelty now. There was only a need for boundaries. "I appreciate you saying that," Tasha said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the heavy emotion in the room. "I know exactly how much it costs your pride to sit in that chair and admit you were wrong." Marcus exhaled a shaky breath, a tiny flicker of desperate hope sparking in his tired eyes. "I forgive you, Dad," she continued, her tone softening just a fraction, but her posture remaining absolute iron. "I am letting go of the anger because carrying it does not serve me or this company. But you need to understand the reality of our relationship moving forward." She leaned forward slightly, holding his gaze, pinning him to the chair with the weight of her words. "You lost the privilege of being in my inner circle. You chose the illusion over the reality, and in doing so you broke a trust that cannot be repaired with a simple apology. You can be a guest at my table, but you will never hold the keys to my house again. You will never have a say in my business, and you will never be allowed to influence my decisions." Marcus absorbed the words like physical blows, but he nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. It was the exact discipline and uncompromising strength that he had failed to recognize in her for 12 years. He stood up, wiping his eyes, a broken but profoundly wiser man. He simply thanked her for her time, turned around, and walked out of the office, the heavy glass door clicking softly behind him. Tasha watched him go, a quiet, profound sense of closure settling over her. The past was officially buried. She reached for her coffee mug, ready to dive back into the quarterly projections, when the private emergency line on her desk phone suddenly began to ring. She picked up the receiver. Tasha speaking. It was the lead investigator from her private legal team. His voice was incredibly tense, urgent, and completely devoid of its usual professional calm. "Ms. Wilson, I know you ordered us to drop the surveillance on your sister after the eviction, but we just received an emergency call from the downtown police precinct. It is about Jasmine. She is at the precinct filing a police report against Trent." The investigator continued, his voice tight. "He completely emptied her personal checking accounts before fleeing the state. She is practically destitute, trying to scrape together enough cash just to afford a basic divorce attorney." I listened to the report without a single spike in my heart rate. "Close the file," I instructed, my tone flat. "Cancel the surveillance detail and send me the final invoice. She is no longer my concern." I placed the receiver back on its cradle. The chapter on my family was officially closed. A month later, the reality of Jasmine's catastrophic downfall presented itself to me in the most mundane setting possible. I was hosting a critical business lunch with a regional supply chain director to finalize a massive distribution contract for Apex Solutions. We chose a busy mid-tier steakhouse in the downtown financial district. It was loud, efficient, and decidedly lacking the Michelin stars Jasmine used to demand for her Tuesday brunches. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant mid-sentence, discussing quarterly logistics with my client. I stepped up to the hostess stand and looked at the woman hiding behind a stack of laminated menus. It was Jasmine. The shock hit her so hard she actually took a physical step backward, bumping into the reservation podium. She was wearing the restaurant's standard issue uniform, a stiff black polyester button-down shirt and a dark apron. Her designer blowouts and expensive manicures were gone. Her hair was pulled back into a severe practical bun, and her face looked hollowed out, exhausted and terrified. She clutched the menus to her chest, staring at me with wide, panicked eyes, waiting for the inevitable humiliation. She braced herself for the shouting, the mocking, the public execution she knew she deserved. I did not smile. I did not sneer. I did not feel a single ounce of triumph. Reservation for 2 under Wilson. I said, my voice perfectly level and strictly professional. Jasmine swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the loud restaurant. Right this way, she whispered, her voice barely functioning. She turned and walked us through the crowded dining room. I noticed the scuff marks on her sensible black shoes and the slight tremble in her hands as she set the menus down on the wooden table. She poured our water glasses, her hands shaking so badly the ice clinked against the crystal. She was waiting for the jab. She was waiting for me to make a comment about her uniform or ask her how Trent was doing. She was a narcissist who thrived on conflict, and she was fully prepared for a war. "Thank you," I said without looking at her. I immediately turned my attention back to my client, unfolding my napkin and resuming our conversation about supply route efficiencies. For the next hour, Jasmine hovered near our section. Every time she walked past, she kept her eyes glued to the floor, waiting for me to summon her, waiting for me to make a scene. But I completely ignored her. I did not treat her like a disgraced sister or a conquered enemy. I treated her exactly like a stranger performing a service. I laughed with my client, I negotiated terms, and I successfully closed a multi-million-dollar catering contract right in front of her face. When the lunch concluded, the waiter dropped the leather billfold on our table. I pulled out my sleek black corporate card and paid the tab. As I signed the merchant copy, I looked at the total. I added a $200 cash tip, sliding the crisp bills under the receipt. It was not an act of sisterly love or quiet forgiveness. It was an act of absolute crushing detachment. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and shook my client's hand. As we walked toward the exit, I saw Jasmine standing near the wait station. She watched me leave, then slowly walked over to my empty table. I paused near the door, glancing back just in time to see her pick up the leather billfold. She saw the $200 tip and froze. The realization washed over her face, completely breaking whatever fragile ego she had left. If I had yelled at her, she could have played the victim. If I had laughed at her, she could have called me cruel. But the tip proved something far more devastating. I did not hate her anymore. I did not care enough to hate her. To a narcissist like Jasmine, total indifference is the ultimate insult. She realized in that exact moment that she was no longer a rival. She was no longer a threat. She was entirely insignificant to my world. I pushed open the doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, leaving her standing alone in a crowded restaurant holding a handful of cash she desperately needed. My client waved a final goodbye and climbed into a waiting taxi. I took a deep breath of the city air, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. Before I could even signal for my own driver, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an unrecognized number with the state capital area code. I answered the call with my usual professional greeting. "Tasha Wilson, Apex Solutions." "Miss Wilson." The voice on the other end was formal and clipped. "This is David Sterling, Chief of Staff for the Governor's Office. We have been closely following the incredible corporate turnaround you have executed over the past few weeks. The Governor is hosting his inaugural gala next month, and we are completely overhauling our vendor list. We want Apex Solutions to handle the entire event. We need to know if you are available to meet tomorrow morning." "I am entirely available." "Mr. Sterling," I replied, my voice completely steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Have your office send over the preliminary guest counts and the venue schematics. I will see you tomorrow at 9. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The street noise of downtown seemed to fade into a quiet hum. This was the exact moment the trajectory of my life permanently locked into its upward ascent. The governor's inaugural gala was not just an event, it was a masterclass in absolute operational dominance. I stood on the balcony overlooking the grand ballroom of the state capitol, watching my floor managers execute my directives with military precision. We had rebranded the enterprise to Apex Elite Logistics to reflect the sheer scale of our new capabilities. We were no longer just catering dinners. We were orchestrating massive multi-tiered corporate and political experiences. 300 waitstaff moved in perfect synchronization. The lighting, the acoustics, the flawless progression of the five-course service, everything operated under my direct command. When the governor took the stage and publicly thanked Apex Elite Logistics for a night of unparalleled excellence, my phone immediately began vibrating with inquiries from every major corporate board in the state. The next 6 months were a relentless, aggressive expansion. We secured contracts for global tech summits, high society charity galas, and exclusive celebrity retreats. I expanded our fleet of refrigerated trucks, doubled our warehouse capacity, and acquired 2 smaller boutique logistics firms to absorb their regional routing networks. I walked through ballrooms checking floral arrangements with a sharp eye while simultaneously negotiating wholesale supply chain deals on my headset. My kitchen staff, the people who had stayed loyal to me through the darkest days of the company, were now managing their own divisions, receiving full benefits and earning salaries they had previously thought impossible. As my empire aggressively expanded, the rotting remnants of my past were simultaneously being dragged into the harsh light of federal justice. Trent's trial was a spectacular public humiliation. He had been captured attempting to board a flight to a non-extradition country with a forged passport and a duffel bag full of stolen cash. I watched a brief clip of his arraignment on the evening news while reviewing my quarterly profit margins. Trent looked entirely unrecognizable. The charming country club facade had completely melted away. He stood before a federal judge in a bright orange jumpsuit, his hair unkempt, his face pale and gaunt. He was facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. He had no expensive legal team to defend him. He was completely alone, facing the devastating consequences of underestimating the wrong woman. Miles away in a cramped, low-income duplex on the absolute edge of the city, Marcus and Brenda watched the exact same news broadcast. They sat in their small, dimly lit living room, eating a cheap frozen dinner on a worn coffee table. The massive, sprawling mansion they used to command had been sold to cover their mounting legal debts. Their country club memberships were gone. Their social circle had entirely evaporated the moment their bank accounts hit zero. They watched the television screen in total silence as the news anchor transitioned from Trent's federal indictment to a glowing local feature on the meteoric rise of Apex Elite Logistics. Marcus stared at the screen, watching footage of me confidently directing a massive corporate summit. His eyes were hollow-heavy with the agonizing realization that the legacy he had desperately craved was thriving and expanding right in front of him, but he was permanently locked out. Brenda sat beside him, her hands gripping a cheap paper napkin. She watched me wearing a tailored designer suit standing next to the governor. All the wealth, all the prestige, all the social power she had worshipped her entire life was now firmly in my hands. They were forced to watch my ultimate triumph from the sidelines, entirely cut off from the financial benefits, completely exiled from the kingdom I had built. I did not think about them. I was too busy preparing for my cover shoot. A major national business magazine had selected me for their annual feature highlighting Black women building solo empires. The photo shoot took place in my newly renovated corner office, a massive glass-enclosed suite that overlooked the entire city skyline. The lighting technicians adjusted the heavy softboxes while the photographer snapped test shots. I sat behind my polished glass desk, wearing a sharp ivory suit, my posture relaxed but completely commanding. The journalist sitting across from me was a sharp, perceptive woman who had spent the last 2 hours meticulously documenting my transition from an ousted line cook to the chief executive officer of the premier logistics firm in the state. She asked about my profit margins, my supply chain innovations, and the intense loyalty of my staff. I answered her questions with concise, calculated precision. I did not mention the betrayal. I did not mention Trent or Jasmine or the parents who had thrown me away. I spoke only of the future. The journalist leaned forward, clicking her pen shut and resting it on her notepad. She looked around the massive office, taking in the sheer, undeniable magnitude of what I had accomplished in less than a year. She looked back at me, her expression filled with genuine, profound admiration. "Tasha," she said, her voice quiet but intensely focused, "you have completely redefined the hospitality and logistics industry in this state. You have built a massive legacy entirely on your own terms. What is the secret to building such a massive legacy?" I held her gaze for a long, quiet moment, letting the weight of the question settle into the air between us. I thought about the 12 years I had spent sweating over hot stoves, burning my hands, and breaking my back to build a company that refused to put my name on the door. I thought about Marcus parading around the country club, claiming my victories as his own. I thought about Brenda treating me like the hired help at her society dinners, and Jasmine sneering at my flour-dusted shoes. I thought about the absolute terrifying freefall of being fired from my own life and the sheer ruthless determination it took to claw my way back to the top. The secret is knowing your worth and realizing that sometimes the dead weight holding you back shares your last name. You cannot build generational wealth with people who only value the aesthetic of success. The journalist stopped writing. She looked up from her notepad, absorbing the intense gravity of the statement. A slow, understanding smile spread across her face. She nodded once, snapping her pen shut. She knew exactly what she had just captured. She had her cover quote the perfect distillation of my entire journey. The interview concluded with a firm handshake and a mutual unspoken respect. I walked her out of the executive suite, guiding her to the private elevator banks, and waited until the silver doors glided shut. When I turned back toward my office, I felt a profound shift in my own physiology. The corporate maneuvering for the day was completely finished. The press was handled, the supply chain contracts were signed, and the high-level networking was secure. But a logistics firm is only as good as the actual product it delivers, and my heart had always belonged to the fire. I walked into my office, but I did not sit back down at the polished glass desk. I removed my tailored suit jacket, draping it carefully over the back of my leather executive chair. I unbuttoned my cuffs, rolling the crisp white fabric of my sleeves up to my elbows. I stepped out of the suite and bypassed the grand marble lobby, taking the heavy industrial service elevator down to the ground floor. The doors slid open to the staging corridors of Apex Elite Logistics. This was the beating heart of my empire. The noise was immediate, a beautiful, chaotic rhythm of rolling carts shouting dispatchers and the heavy thud of refrigerated truck doors slamming shut on the loading docks. I walked past the logistics bays and pushed through the heavy double-swinging doors, stepping directly onto the floor of the massive state-of-the-art master kitchen. It was a breathtaking sight. The facility spanned 50,000 square feet of pristine, gleaming stainless steel. Industrial ventilation hoods hummed with a quiet, powerful efficiency, pulling the rich, complex aromas of roasting garlic, seared Wagyu beef, and fresh thyme high into the air. 4 separate prep lines were running simultaneously, executing the menus for 3 different high-profile galas scheduled for that exact evening. It was a massive, perfectly tuned machine, operating with terrifying precision. When I walked into the room, the atmosphere did not drop into a state of paralyzed terror like it used to under the management of Marcus or Trent. The staff did not scramble to look busy or frantically try to hide their mistakes. Instead, a wave of genuine, profound respect washed over the floor. The executive sous chefs looked up from their stations and offered sharp, professional nods. The line cooks straightened their posture, moving with an intense, focused pride. They knew I was not just a CEO managing a spreadsheet from a glass tower. They knew I was the woman who had built the recipes, who had bled over the same stoves, who had fought tooth and nail to secure their jobs, their health care, and their dignity. I walked down the central aisle, my eyes scanning the incredibly precise choreography of my kitchen. The ingredients sitting on the prep tables were top-tier, locally sourced, and completely flawless. The cheap artificial corners Trent had ruthlessly cut to line his own pockets were entirely eradicated. The standards were absolute, and every single person in the room was operating at their absolute peak, because I compensated them fairly and treated them like actual professionals. I reached the main expediting station at the very front of the kitchen. A crisp, pristine white apron was folded neatly on the steel counter, waiting specifically for me. I picked it up, wrapped the heavy cotton strings around my waist, and tied a tight, secure knot. The familiar weight of the apron grounded me instantly, washing away the last remnants of the corporate boardroom. I picked up my silver clipboard, scanning the evening's final ticket counts and timing logistics, verifying the routing schedules for the governor's inaugural ball. I looked up at my crew, my empire, my legacy. A deep, genuine smile spread across my face. There were no tears left to cry for the family that had discarded me. There were no sad, lingering monologues about betrayal or heartbreak, or the agonizing pain of being the unloved, invisible child. I had completely and permanently purged the poison from my life. They had pushed me to the absolute edge of a cliff, expecting me to plummet into the abyss. They had humiliated me, robbed me, and tried to erase my entire existence just to prop up their own fragile, narcissistic egos. They had assumed I would simply disappear into the background and watch them claim my glory. Instead, I took the leap and I learned exactly how to fly. I did not just survive the wolves in my family. I turned around, bought the entire forest, and locked them out of it forever. The past was dead, and the future was entirely mine. "Let us get to work," I called out to the kitchen, my voice carrying the absolute, unwavering certainty of a woman who owned her world. The kitchen roared back to life, a beautiful, perfect symphony of fire and steel.